So my name is Chris McCarthy. I'm a professor in the Department of Educational Psychology here in the college, and my professional specialization is counseling psychology that deals with helping people and counseling and things like that. My research for the last 20 years has really focused on the occupational health of teachers, and particularly how stress affects their health. So I've done a number of different studies trying to define what teacher stress is, and then what are the repercussions for teachers, and then also what can we do to help. So what kinds of interventions can we do to help reduce their stress and help them thrive basically in the schools. It's a term that is used a lot, and it sometimes has a lot of different meanings for different people. So I think when psychologists talk about stress, they're really talking about a variety of psychological, physical, and emotional consequences of feeling like we can't cope with life demands. So the psychological are things like anxiety, feeling worried, and the emotions, kind of the same thing, are, feeling anxious, feeling upset. And then physiologically, we all know what stress feels like with your heart rate and pulse and trouble sleeping and concentrating and things like that. Those are the symptoms, but we really think the cause is feeling like you can't cope with the things that you have to do in a given day or the events that are thrown at you. We use the term appraisal. Basically, it's kind of like appraising what your demands are and then what are my resources. So when those two things are equal, that's when we usually feel very positive about things, like we can handle the things that are thrown at us. And when the demands are too high, that's when stress can ensue. And then the other thing I'll just mention is it's really kind of a biological response that's built into us that helps us survive historically. People call it the fight or flight response. So your body gears up to either escape a situation or confront somebody that's coming after you. And that was helpful thousands of years ago and helped people survive. But now it's less than worthless because it really kind of interferes with our ability to cope in a modern world. We experience all of these consequences of stress, and they actually get in the way of us coping effectively. For teachers, we've really just tried to translate that understanding to the teacher's job. So we really focus a lot on the classroom particularly. So what kinds of demands does the teacher have in the classroom? And then what resources do they have for addressing the daily challenges they have in their teaching responsibilities? And it's the same kind of thing. When their demands are too high, that's when the consequences of stress play out for teachers. And that can be things like reduced job satisfaction, feeling burned out in the long run. And then eventually what happens to a lot of teachers, unfortunately, is they make the decision to leave the teaching profession. So that's where we see a lot of turnover in teaching. I think there's a couple of different reasons why teaching is particularly stressful. And it doesn't often come to mind for people. We think of like police and firefighters and, military in a war zone. And obviously those are like extremely stressful and very difficult situations, especially when they're actually in action. And it doesn't seem like it's the same kind of life or death situation. Any profession where you're dealing with people all day, that can be really challenging, very demanding. And teachers are in front of kids all day, every day, every day they're doing that. I think another piece of it is we have taken away some autonomy from teachers. So unlike other professions, if you think of like physicians or professors like me, we have a lot of freedom to do our jobs the way we think is best. And a lot of times with teachers, especially with accountability measures that have been around for quite some time, it seems like the message is that we don't trust teachers to do their job. We need to keep testing their students to see if they're really effective. So there's that kind of reduced autonomy that affects teachers. And then I think just kind of lack of respect for the profession. Like we say that we value teachers, but we all know they're underpaid. As a psychologist, I can say any profession that is predominantly made up of females, which teaching is, it's about 80% female, tends to be undervalued, tends to be paid less than professions that are predominantly men. I mean, that's just a fact. So, they're highly educated. I think they start to think about like, there's a lot of other things I could be doing where I could make more money and get more respect sometimes. So I think we're really just beginning to understand that. I've done some work with my students with one of the neighboring school districts around Austin. And we did like monthly check-ins with the teachers and asked them about their demands and resources as the pandemic was unfolding. Really what affected the teachers most was just a switch to online learning. A lot of them talked about losing connection with their students, so being a teacher in a classroom gives you a sense of place and context, and they see the students all day and they can greet them. Also, just having to switch over to technology and essentially doing two jobs at once, where they had to do some kind of online instruction and then also sometimes doing it in person. So I think all of those, plus the loss of connection with their students, really made it quite demanding, as well as just kind of the uncertainty of it, from month to month. And then, of course, in Texas, not only were they dealing with the pandemic, but also losing even more time with a storm that kind of knocked things out for a week. It was kind of like one trauma on top of another for teachers in Texas. It's really about those two pieces of the puzzle. So the demands and the resources, it's almost like your checkbook. I mean, back when we used to use checkbooks, that, it's like you're financially healthy if you have about as much money coming in as going out. And when those two are out of balance, you can get into trouble pretty quickly. So for teachers, it's really, I think it's both of those pieces of the puzzle. Which of the demands are the most salient for the teachers and causing the most difficulty? And then how can we bolster their resources? It's not like every teacher is equally stressed, although it's a demanding profession. Really, a lot of research, including ours, suggests that it's like 1/4 to a third of the teachers are really the ones that have the high demands compared to the resources. And it's not necessarily located in a particular school or a school district. I think a lot of has to do with just the teacher themselves and the school that they're in, or whether it's a good fit, whether they're a good fit for the profession. So focusing in on which teachers really need the most help. And it can be like the newer teachers, when they first come into the profession, they're often very idealistic and wanting to change the world, which is all a good thing. And then they're confronted with all the realities of the classroom, and there's kind of an adjustment process. Of course, we all know that some schools have more resources than others financially. Some teachers are just in a more resource school environment. But then it's also individually them as educators, do they get to the support that they need? Do they get the right support as they're beginning? We also find that, new teachers get oftentimes handed the most difficult classrooms, because teachers who've been around for a while develop some political capital in their schools, and this is not a sinister thing. It's just naturally they get over time into like some of the more advanced classes or AP classes or things like that. And oftentimes it's the new teachers who get some of the more challenging classrooms. All of the things we can do to support them would be like giving them self-care, which I think we're going to talk about, mentoring, which I know is part of the START program, but also really just being intentional about not treating all teachers the same. As one example, like we've used some national survey data with teachers to show that particularly when teachers have a really rough first year, after the first 4 or 5 years, they're twice as likely to leave the profession as teachers who have a more stable first year, like they're not exposed to a lot of stress. So, and what we find, those teachers who experience a lot of stress in the beginning, what tends to happen is they try and move schools a little bit, they try and move around and find a different campus. And when that doesn't work, then they make the choice to leave the profession. Well, I think mentorship is pretty key. We've done some research with it, and there's obviously a lot of existing research that almost any profession, having a mentor is pretty critical, especially in the beginning. Particularly, there's like certain things that a mentor can do that can be really helpful, like helping teachers manage their time effectively. Time management is a bit of a cliche. We all hear that, and it sometimes, sounds good, but we can never put it into practice. But we find that the teachers who really kind of understand the nature of their job and what's the most important thing to spend time on, and then where to like prioritize their self-care, are really the ones who report the less stress. And that's something that a mentor can pass on to a new teacher who hasn't developed that experience. A lot of times teachers can receive mixed messages about that, particularly, when they're new, and the importance of taking care of students and meeting student needs, all that kind of stuff is like right in your face. Oftentimes that self-care piece can be lost. The other thing I just mentioned is, is being a kind of a sounding board. The one thing about teaching that we find as well is that they're around people all day, they're around young people, but they don't get a lot of time to connect with each other. They might be in like staff meetings or professional development or things like that, but they don't have like really restorative kind of connections with other people. There's just not much time for that. Carving out time for a mentor just to kind of sit down with a newer teacher and just check in and just be kind of an ally, I think is really important too. It's pretty much what it sounds like, taking care of the self. But I think what's most important in terms of actually practicing self-care is really that understanding that balance of demands in your life and resources. Self-care is really about bolstering your own resources. And when we talk about resources for human beings, they can be like almost anything that helps us cope. It can be like doing yoga, mindfulness, all that kind of stuff to work on ourselves. It can be having a supportive network of other people. It can be having adequate financial resources. So anything that helps you cope really kind of falls into the basket of self-care. And again, what you're trying to do is kind of bolster the resources you have to cope with your life demands. And the other piece of self-care is it's not just bolstering your resources. So a lot of self-care can just be like taking some demands off your plate, which is again, something that teachers are very altruistic and they get into the profession because they want to help people. So that's a hard thing sometimes for teachers to do. So it's not just about like making yourself into a super coper. It's more, or it can be just as important just to like shut things out, don't get on email, don't have to return phone calls that aren't critical. Just things you can do to like reduce your daily requirements can be really important. Teachers who are aware of their own stress levels, teachers who are kind of like tuned in emotionally to their students and can tell when they're having a bad day, and respond with empathy whenever possible, really are kind of teaching their students those kinds of skills, like concern for other people and kind of it's kind of that social emotional learning piece that's so important in the schools. One of the things that we focus on lately in our work is the notion of trauma and how it affects students. So trauma, a reaction that we have to really disruptive events in our lives. So some would say the pandemic represented a trauma for a lot of people. And one of the things that happens with trauma is that, it can be very hard to stay in the present moment if you've had a traumatic experience. So you're sometimes reliving it and really not being able to focus on what's in front of you. And a large number of students in schools have had some kind of trauma experience, and they bring that into the classroom. And it can be perceived as a student being willfully disobedient or not being motivated. And when in fact, it's really kind of a response to a very, very stressful event. So I think when teachers respond to student behavior, whatever possible, with compassion and empathy and really try to understand what's happening, as opposed to just, which we can all do, just kind of being reactive in the moment and trying to like stop the behavior without understanding what's causing it. Well, I think that's really critical. And part of the work we've done with our research team has been some small groups that we've created for teachers. So we've been doing that for a number of years and have a lot of different campuses where they've let us come in and lead groups with teachers where we've tried to do some education about stress, what it is and how it can be harmful and what you can do about it. And the teachers appreciate the information, but I think what we found is what they really appreciate is just the chance to connect and talk with each other about their experiences in a way that's different, when they're talking with a lead teacher or an administrator or even a mentor sometimes. So sometimes just a bunch of people going through the same kinds of things. And we've seen them like really offer a lot of support to each other in the moment and just having a place to talk about it. That's really critical. But I think the schools really need to foster space for that. Having something like on the campus that's like kind of built into their daily schedule would be really helpful, and we found it to be really helpful. So giving teachers kind of the opportunity to support each other can be really key. We've really done a lot of work lately on the demographics of schools. Public schools are more than 50% students in minoritized groups, so non-white groups, and the teaching is 80%. And we've started looking at whether that is a source of stress for teachers. because there's such a demographic imbalance between the teaching profession, which is overwhelmingly white and female, and then the student US public schools are very diverse. And we do find that it's one interesting thing is that schools are very racially concentrated. There are a lot of schools that are 75% or more white, and then 75% or more minoritized groups. Great benefit to students having a teacher from their same racial ethnic background, but there's not enough teachers to go around. And there's also some concern that it adds to the teacher's stress, just like it does in higher education, where faculty of color get tasked with taking care of all of the diversity initiatives on campus, and working with all of the students of color, seeking mentors. So yeah, that is a big piece of it. I think our focus has been like on how does that contribute to the teacher's stress. We need more diverse workforce, which is true, but right now we're not able to retain teachers of color. Like they don't stay in the profession, probably for those same reasons, which is like not only going to be a teacher, but you're going to be a role model for all the students of color, and you're going to see, which is great in some ways. The teachers are willing to do this, but it's like you've got to be Superman or Superwoman to really carry that out. So it's like it's kind of referred to as a hidden tax on those teachers, whether it's directly communicated or indirectly. I think most teachers of color feel that, which is like they're going to go into a school and they're going to make a difference in those students' lives, which again is great. It's just like another demand. Well, I would say definitely what we talked about is like kind of have some self-care in place. It's often a lot better if it's, I think, and easier to practice if you put it into place before you encounter a lot of stress, if it's already been part of your day. So making time for exercise, having a way to kind of get support from other people is nice before you're already stressed out. Because once you're already stressed out, then you're just already depleted and trying to like just get back up to where you were before. But if you can kind of put those things into place, it could really be really helpful. And then the second thing I'd say is really, monitor your demands. I think that's the piece that often seems too simple to people, but really, again, I'll go back to the analogy of your bank account. Financial planning really involves like being aware of the money you're spending and what you're spending it on and where you need to make changes. And I'd say the same is true for like everyday stress, that if you're just doing things, because you've always done it that way, checking email, even though you don't really need to right away, which I'm guilty of, that can really start to be very depleting. Deciding like kind of what kinds of things are most important to you in a day and where you want to put your energy, and being able to let some things go can be really important too. And again, those are things that are good to put into place before you get hit with a lot of stress. So as the academics starts, then the demands are going to really ramp up. So it's good to start putting some of those plans in place before things get really out of hand.